Welcome to Lesson 2 of Section 11 of the BJCP training program from the Brewers Anonymous Homebrew Club. In this lesson, we are going to expand on what we've already learned about ale and lager yeast and add bacteria to the discussion in terms of beer fermentation. So, let's get started. Let's start off by talking a little bit more in depth about ale yeast. Ale yeast is sometimes referred to as top fermenting yeast in beer brewing. This description comes from the generally higher flocculation character of ale yeast. That's the term when the yeast colonies clump together. These clumps of flocculated yeast are more buoyant when they're stuck together. With that, the initial CO2 byproduct production in fermentation lifts these flocculated colonies to the top of the fermenter. While there, the colonies are still light enough that the surface tension of the fermenting wort, now technically beer at this point, are able to hold and collect these colonies at the top of the fermenting beer. The general optimal temperature range for ale yeast is 55 degrees to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Dropping into lower temperature ranges, the yeast will go dormant. Fermenting at higher temperatures leads to potential production of off flavors and aromas. The general apparent attenuation range for ale yeast is 69 to 80% attenuation. Ale yeast can fully ferment the following common sugars: glucose, fructose, maltose, sucrose, and maltotriose. Ales can also ferment the following trace sugars, meaning there aren't a lot of these particular sugars in wort, but if they're there, the yeast can ferment them, and that is cellulose, mannose, and galactose. Ale yeast can partially, but not fully, ferment raffinose, the common trisaccharide produced in wort production. We hadn't referred to the trisaccharides by its proper name of raffinose until this point of the training, and the fact that it comes up in our exam guide at this point by name, it's probably important that we know that is the name of this particular trisaccharide that's produced in wort. With needing a higher temperature to ferment, this leads to production of esters in the beer. These are the fruity and sweet-smelling aromas typically found in ales. German Weizen strain specifically produced high amounts of clove-like phenols and bubblegum and banana-like esters, and that's a signature characteristic of that style. Now, let's talk more about lager yeasts. In brewing, lager yeast is sometimes referred to as bottom fermenting yeast. This is due to their low flocculation. Unlike ale yeast, lager yeast tend to keep from clumping together and fall to the bottom of the fermenter during fermentation. Lager yeast strains can be further broken down into two categories. First, the Forberg strain type, or the less formal names of powdery or dusty types. These strains tend to ferment quickly. This is partially because these yeast strains do not flocculate well, and with that, they remain in suspension in the wort longer, allowing the yeast to rip through those fermentable sugars a little faster. They also tend to have a higher attenuation range. And the second subcategory is the Saz strains, or also referred to as SU or break strains, referred to by someone apparently, according to the exam study guide, because I have never heard these nicknames personally before. But again, they're in our exam guide, so here's the information. These flocculate a little more than the Forberg strains, but not as much as ale strains. The general optimal fermentation temperature range for lager yeast is 46 to 56 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a point where I remind all the experienced brewers watching these videos that this exam is based on traditional methods. The optimal temperature range of yeast strains has been challenged many times by modern brewing methods, my own methods included. For this exam, we need to keep the focus on the older traditional methods, and traditionally speaking, the optimal temperature range for lager yeast strains is 46 to 56 degrees Fahrenheit. The exam study guide notes one specific exception, and that is the California lager yeast strain, noting this strain's optimal temperature range is 67 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. The general apparent attenuation range for lager yeast strains is 67 to 77% attenuation. Lager yeasts are able to ferment these common sugars: glucose, fructose, maltose, sucrose, maltotriose, and the lager strains can fully ferment the trisaccharide raffinose. They can also ferment these trace sugars, the cellulose, mannose, and galactose. Lager strains do not produce the esters and fusel alcohols that ale yeast can produce. Lager yeast tend to produce a cleaner aroma to the finished beer, and with that, they accentuate the character of the malt and hops used by the brewer when they produce the wort. Now, let's talk about bacteria. And as much as sanitation and keeping everything as clean and sanitized as possible during our entire process, there are some cases where we want to infect our beer with bacteria. But not just any bacteria, desirable bacteria. We want complete control of the bacteria we use and how and where we use it. One of those desirable bacteria are Lactobacillus delbrueckii, or just Lactobacillus for short, or even Lacto for shorter. Lactobacillus is used in producing the Berliner Weiss style of beer. Its primary contribution is to produce lactic acid and provide that signature sourness to that style. There's also Brettanomyces, or simply Brett for short. These are used in different extents in producing lambics. Depending on the result we're trying to get will help dictate how much we're using and for how long. Brett is also used to produce American wild ale styles and the newly defined style in the 2021 style guidelines simply called Brett beer. Bacteria, or at least the bacteria we'd want to use in brewing, can be divided into two subclasses. First is the gram-negative bacteria. These are the bacteria used in producing lambics. Gram-negative bacteria include Escherichia coli, Centrobacter, and Enterobacter. Gram-negative bacteria can't tolerate the moderate alcohol levels in most beers, and with that, don't survive in the finished beer. The second class is gram-positive bacteria, the class of bacteria used to produce Berliner Weiss beers. Gram-positive bacteria include Pediococcus and Lactobacillus. Gram-positive bacteria produce lactic acid through its own fermentation process. This process differs from the way yeast ferment sugars, namely, they're converting sugars into acids rather than alcohol. It's worth noting, not only because it's in the exam study material, but because it's part of brewing, is that low levels of gram-positive bacteria can produce a diacetyl-like off flavor, which comes across as a sweet butterscotch or buttery character. All right, so that is it for the details on ale and lager yeast and a little bit about those desirable bacteria, and then that is it for this particular lesson. We have more to cover on this subject, so let's do that in lesson 3 next. I will see you there.